Alright, so who is W.E.B. Du Bois? The first thing I want to draw your attention to is the dates that he was alive, 1868 through 1963. Can you imagine being alive for that time period and all of the things you'd see? You miss the end of the Civil War, but you've seen so much, and you die like right on the cusp of when the civil rights movement sort of gains a lot of momentum. So I think it's really cool. His full name is William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. I call him W.E.B. or Du Bois. He's born to a middle-class family in Massachusetts. Obviously, they're free because the Civil War is over. The experience he has when he's growing up is kind of unique because he grows up around a lot of abolitionists and whites who are sympathetic to African American rights. He also grows up around middle-class African Americans, which basically don't exist in the South. He graduates from Fisk University in Atlanta, and he is the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard. He studied sociology and history in Berlin. And so education was super important to him, and that really it really comes to influence his writings and ideology. One of the ways we can look at Du Bois is by drawing a distinction between him and one of his contemporaries, and that's Booker T. Washington. And that's super important because one of the chapters in the book deals explicitly with Washington and Du Bois sort of attacking him for his view. So Washington was born into slavery, and he was the son of an African American woman and a white man. He was the founder of the Tuskegee Institute. He wrote about his experience growing up a slave and transforming himself into a successful individual in his autobiography called Up From Slavery, which is really good if you haven't read it. So the Du Bois and Washington have two really different approaches for how the African American could sort of rise up through the ranks. And Du Bois has a really negative opinion of Washington's methodology. Did I miss one? I didn't. So because he thinks that it's this compromise between asking for freedom for African Americans but accepting racism from whites. He also thinks that Washington places economic well-being above civil and political equality, so we'll see how his view sort of shakes out. According to Washington, African Americans should be educated. Their education should consist of vocational training, right? Like VOTEC. Because Washington is a realist and he thinks, hey, they're going to have to work manual labor jobs because that's what's available. So he thinks that instead of sending everyone to college to get a liberal arts degree, that African Americans should be trained in skilled labor, things like bricklaying, plumbing, and stuff like that. And so Du Bois thinks that Washington is just an Uncle Tom. And I don't really like this interpretation of Washington. I think that Du Bois just kind of has his view wrong. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that we have to view him as an Uncle Tom, but that he's a realist about the system and about the way the world works. Washington values education. You can tell by looking at his autobiography. So I have this quote from him where he says, when I was a slave, I didn't have any schooling, but once I, was able to carry my mistress's books to the door, and I peeked inside and I saw these kids learning, and he said it looked like paradise. So clearly he values education. He wants economic freedom, but not as like the ultimate end. I think he wants it as a means to other ends. He thinks that economic freedom will net African Americans political and social equality. So he doesn't think that they can actually attain the latter goals without first attaining the former. So Du Bois, as a contrast, thinks that if you ask African Americans to give up the fight for things like political power and have them stop insisting on gaining civil rights and higher education for the younger members of their society, and if we focus on industrial education instead, 3 consequences have resulted. First is the disenfranchisement of the Negro. Second is the legal creation of a distinct status of civil inferiority. And third is the steady withdrawal aid from institutions for the higher training. So he says that Washington's methodology reinforces racism and black inferiority. So he tells us on page 30, Mr. Washington represents in Negro thought the old attitude of adjustment and submission. His program naturally takes an economic cast, becoming a gospel of work and money to such an extent as apparently almost completely to overshadow the higher aims of life. His program practically accepts the alleged inferiority of the Negro races. I want to give you a view on the flip side, because I think that Washington really is kind of an optimist. He writes in Up From Slavery, the individual who can do something that the world wants done will, in the end, make his way regardless of his race. So he gives you an example of a guy who goes into a community and he's prepared to supply the people there with an analysis of Greek sentences. And that's not what the community needs right now, because they need bricks and horses and wagons. They need infrastructure. So Washington says, look, if we can supply first the need of bricks and horses and wagons, then it's going to lead to a demand for an analyses of Greek sentences. And with that demand will come the ability to appreciate it and profit by it. So the idea is that these communities they're devastated. They've been devastated by the Civil War, by Reconstruction. Washington thinks that the way to sort of bring people up is to start by building. So I think this is more along the lines of the best interpretation of his view. Even DuBois will acknowledge that, education in a society that's not going to let the African American get ahead anyway doesn't have really great returns on it. So there's this part where DuBois talks about going to teach in Tennessee. And this is when he experiences the South for the first time and sees poverty, and he sees the racism that is he hasn't really been exposed to in the North. And he sees all these kids who are super excited about having a school at first. And, they show up every day, they're ready to learn, and eventually they kind of drop off and they stop showing up. And what happens? They've got to work. They've got to make money for their families. So, he understands that economic concerns are really valid. I really just think that Washington and DuBois, even though they're technically the same era and they are of the same race, they're just kind of two totally different worlds. So you have on one hand Washington, who's a self-made man. He's successful because he obtained economic freedom. But if you take DuBois, you realize that he had a head start on Washington by not being born a slave, by being born in the North. I think each one of them is an optimist about the situation of African Americans, just kind of in a different way. And I also think it bears mentioning that near the end of his life, DuBois actually kind of gives up. He becomes really disillusioned with the amount of progress that's been made, or the lack thereof. And he becomes really sympathetic to Washington's position on the importance of money and economic freedom. So when the Souls of Black Folk that we read doesn't give us this kind of picture, but toward the end of his life, he does kind of change his mind. So what is it that we're reading? What kind of text is this? The Souls of Black Folk is so cool because it is kind of an ethnography with it includes stories from people, it includes historical information, and he's really trying to give us a multifaceted picture of what it means to be Black in America after the Civil War. This is a book that's geared toward white people, actually, because, Black people in the South don't need to know what their lives are like because they live them. It's geared toward upper class Blacks in the North who may be kind of unaware of the situation of Blacks in the South, and it's directed at white people who, have not thought about this stuff really reflectively. So what DuBois is trying to do is reveal the challenges and difficulties that face the African American community as the war has ended and they're trying to lead these free lives, but they are constantly bogged down by the complications that are created by slavery. They don't have economic independence, they're still segregated, there's still racism. So that's the point of the text. And if you're interested, there's a really good article that I'll post on Blackboard if you have time to read it, by Ta-Nehisi Coates, that sort of talks about the lingering effects of slavery. So that's what the Souls of Black Folk is about, and then in the next set of slides, I'll go into some details about some of the big ideas in the text.